November 18, 1944. The Hürtgen Forest stretched dark and menacing along the German-Belgian border, a landscape of dense evergreens and steep ravines where American forces had been fighting for 6 brutal weeks, with casualties mounting and progress measured in meters rather than kilometers. Corporal Jack Hayes lay motionless in the attic of a ruined farmhouse 300 meters behind the front line, his Springfield M1903A4 sniper rifle resting on sandbags positioned beneath a shattered window that overlooked a narrow forest trail. Through a scope, he watched 2 German soldiers moving quickly along the trail, carrying message pouches that identified them as couriers running communications between forward positions and rear headquarters. Hayes had been tracking similar courier pairs for 3 days now, observing their routes and timing, understanding that these runners carried tactical intelligence and orders that coordinated German defensive operations. Intercepting these communications would disrupt enemy coordination and potentially save American lives by preventing the carefully timed counterattacks and ambushes that German forces have been executing with devastating effectiveness. But Army sniper doctrine prohibited engaging multiple targets in rapid succession, emphasizing deliberate aimed fire at single high-value targets rather than attempting quick follow-up shots that might compromise accuracy and reveal sniper positions to enemy observers. Jack Hayes was 24 years old, born and raised in rural Wyoming where his father had taught him hunting skills from childhood. He had learned to shoot on the family ranch, developing marksmanship abilities that earned him selection for sniper training after he was drafted in 1943. The training had been rigorous and thorough, emphasizing fieldcraft, camouflage, range estimation, and above all patience, the ability to remain motionless for hours waiting for the perfect shot. Hayes had excelled in training, graduating near the top of his class before deploying to Europe in the spring of 1944. He had fought through France and into Germany, accumulating 27 confirmed kills by the time his unit entered the Hürtgen Forest in early October. The forest fighting differed fundamentally from anything Hayes had experienced previously. Visibility was measured in dozens of meters rather than hundreds. Enemy forces were dug into prepared positions that made individual targets rare and difficult to identify. The most valuable targets were often the courier pairs that moved quickly between positions, carrying information that enabled German tactical coordination. Hayes had watched these couriers repeatedly, identifying their patterns and understanding their importance, but doctrine required him to engage only single targets, allowing the second courier to escape and deliver his messages even after his partner was killed. The restriction frustrated Hayes profoundly because he knew he possessed the skills to engage both couriers if doctrine permitted. The challenge was not marksmanship, but mechanics. The time required to cycle a bolt-action rifle between shots. Standard procedure taught snipers to fire, observe the impact, cycle the bolt deliberately while maintaining scope picture, reacquire the target if necessary, and fire again only after confirming conditions remained favorable. This methodical process ensured accuracy and prevented hasty shots that might miss and compromise the sniper's concealment. But it also consumed time, typically 4 to 6 seconds between aimed shots, far too long to engage a second courier who would be sprinting for cover the instant his partner was hit. Hayes understood the reasoning behind doctrine. Snipers who revealed their positions by missing shots or by firing multiple rounds from the same location faced counterfire from enemy snipers or indirect fire from mortars that could kill them before they could relocate. But Hayes also understood that allowing courier pairs to operate freely was costing American lives, that German coordination enabled by these communications was resulting in ambushes and counterattacks that killed his friends and fellow soldiers. The tension between following safe doctrine and taking risks that might save lives had been building in Hayes for weeks, finally reaching a breaking point after November 15th ambush that killed 3 men from his platoon, an ambush that German couriers had likely coordinated through messages Hayes had watched them carry, but had not been authorized to interdict. On the evening of November 17th, Hayes had made a decision that violated his training and risked court-martial. He would develop a technique for engaging courier pairs rapidly enough to kill both before the second could escape, accepting the additional risk this entailed in exchange for the tactical benefits of disrupting German communications. The key to success lay in minimizing the time between shots, reducing the 4 to 6 second standard to something closer to 2 seconds, fast enough to engage a fleeing target before he could reach cover. Hayes analyzed the bolt cycling process systematically, identifying where time was lost and how procedures might be modified. The standard technique required the shooter to break his firing position, lift his right hand from the trigger to grasp the bolt handle, operate the bolt with deliberate movements to ensure reliable extraction and feeding, then return his hand to the trigger before firing again. Each step consumed time and required repositioning that disrupted aim. Hayes envisioned a modified technique that kept his cheek welded to the stock and his eye on the scope throughout the entire cycling process, operating the bolt with a support hand, while his firing hand maintained trigger control and his body position remained absolutely stable. The modified technique required significant practice to execute reliably. Hayes spent hours in concealed position rehearsing the movements, dry firing repeatedly until the motions became automatic. The key was positioning his left hand on the rifle's forestock in a way that allowed him to quickly reach the bolt handle, operate it with a sharp upward, backward, forward, down motion that extracted the spent cartridge and chambered a fresh round, then immediately return his hand to support position while his right hand broke the next shot. The entire sequence needed to flow as one continuous movement rather than distinct steps, eliminating the pauses that consumed time in standard procedures. Hayes discovered that by angling his body slightly different from standard prone position and by using a specific type of rest that elevated the rifle's rear slightly, he could execute the modified bolt operation without losing his sight picture through the scope. This meant he could track a moving target continuously even while cycling the action, maintaining aim throughout the process rather than having to reacquire the target after each shot. The position felt awkward initially, requiring muscle groups to work in unfamiliar ways. But with practice it became natural, and Hayes found he could consistently achieve cycle times under 2 seconds while maintaining sufficient accuracy for combat ranges under 400 meters. The improvised rest that made Hayes' technique possible came from an unlikely source: the structural rafters exposed in the ruined farmhouse attic where he had established his hide position. By positioning sandbags on a rafter that ran perpendicular to his firing direction and resting his rifle across these sandbags at a specific height and angle, Hayes created a platform that provided stable support while allowing his body to assume the position necessary for rapid bolt operation. The rafter's elevation meant Hayes was firing from approximately 2 meters above the floor, an unconventional height that doctrine discouraged because it created silhouette issues and limited maneuverability. But the elevation also provided excellent fields of fire across the forest trails below and allowed the specific body mechanics Hayes' technique required. He refined the position through trial and error, adjusting sandbag placement and his body angle until he achieved what felt like optimal balance between stability and operational speed. Other snipers who observed his setup found it unusual, questioning why he was positioned so high and at such an odd angle. Hayes deflected these questions with vague statements about sight lines and comfort, not wanting to explain his technique before he had tested it in actual combat, and confirmed it worked under stress and unpredictability of engaging live targets. The opportunity to test his innovation came on the morning of November 18th, when Hayes observed 2 German couriers approaching along a trail he had been monitoring for 3 days. They moved quickly but not frantically, confident in the forest cover and in timing that had worked successfully on previous runs. Hayes' estimated range at 320 meters, well within his effective engagement envelope, and wind was minimal, reducing one variable that could complicate rapid shooting. He settled into his position, checking that his spare ammunition was readily accessible and that no obstacles would interfere with his modified bolt cycling motion. His breathing slowed and deepened, the pre-shot routine he had executed hundreds of times, mind focusing on the task while body relaxed to reduce tremor and tension. The lead courier entered his crosshairs, and Hayes tracked him smoothly, waiting for the moment when both runners would be visible and the trailing courier would not yet have cover available for immediate escape. That moment came as they crossed a small clearing, perhaps 15 meters wide, both men visible and committed to the open ground. Hayes pressed the trigger smoothly, felt the rifle recoil, saw through his scope as the lead courier collapsed. His left hand was already moving, reaching the bolt handle, cycling the action in one fluid motion, while his eye never left the scope and his point of aim tracked right to where the second courier had reacted to the shot by accelerating into a sprint toward the nearest cover. The second shot broke approximately 2 seconds after the first, Hayes' finger pressing the trigger, while the second courier was still in the open, running hard but not yet having reached the tree line that would provide concealment. The round struck center mass, the courier's forward momentum carrying him several more steps before he collapsed and lay still. Hayes remained in position for several seconds, observing confirmed both targets were down and scanning for threats that might have detected his position. No return fire came. No movement indicated enemy reaction beyond the two dead couriers lying in the clearing. Hayes carefully withdrew from his firing position. Moving to an alternate location, he prepared in another section of the ruined building. Standard procedure after engaging targets to avoid counterfire directed at his last known position. His mind was processing what had just occurred, confirming that his technique worked, that engaging two targets in rapid succession was feasible despite doctrine that said it was not, and that the tactical benefits were immediate and obvious. Two couriers who would have carried intelligence and orders between German positions were dead, their messages undelivered, their communications disrupted. The ripple effects of the single engagement might include delayed or canceled German operations, confusion about tactical situations, and ultimately American lives saved because enemy coordination had been degraded. Hayes reported the engagement to his platoon sergeant later that day, describing it as two separate engagements that happened to occur in quick succession, deliberately obscuring that he had violated doctrine by attempting rapid follow-up shots from the same position. The sergeant accepted the report without suspicion, noting the kills and platoon log and congratulating Hayes on successful interdiction of enemy communications. But word spread quickly through the sniper community, as it always did when something unusual occurred. Other snipers heard about the dual courier engagement and began asking Hayes how he had managed it. Knowing that engaging two targets before the second could escape exceeded what standard techniques allowed, Hayes initially deflected these inquiries, uncertain whether other snipers would embrace his innovation or report him for violating doctrine. But several persistent colleagues convinced him to demonstrate his technique, arguing that if it worked, it should be shared rather than hoarded, that other snipers faced the same frustrations with courier pairs escaping, and that any method that improved interdiction rates served the broader mission. Hayes agreed to teach a small group, taking 3 trusted snipers to his high position and demonstrating the rafter rest and modified bolt cycling technique he had developed. The reaction was mixed. 2 of the snipers immediately grasped the potential and began practicing the technique themselves, working to develop the muscle memory and positioning discipline it required. The 3rd sniper was skeptical, arguing that the technique was too risky, that firing multiple shots from one position violated fundamental principles of sniper employment, and that Hayes was inviting counterfire that would get him killed. This argument reflected legitimate concerns that Hayes acknowledged, but did not find compelling enough to abandon his innovation. He pointed out that courier interdiction justified elevated risk because the tactical benefits exceeded those of simply picking off isolated soldiers who played no critical role in enemy operations. He noted that his technique actually reduced risk in certain ways by allowing quicker engagement of threats before they could react or call for support. And he emphasized that he was not proposing his technique as universal replacement for standard doctrine, only a specialized application for specific high-value situations where rapid engagement of multiple targets offered advantages that justified the trade-off involved. This nuanced argument persuaded the skeptical sniper, if not to adopt the technique himself, at least to accept that others might reasonably choose to employ it. Over the following week, Hayes' technique spread through informal networks connecting snipers across the regiment. For more snipers adopted the rafter rest approach and modified bolt cycling procedure, achieving their own successful engagements of courier pairs. The cumulative effect began appearing in intelligence reports that noted declining German tactical coordination and increasing response times to American probing attacks. German forces that had previously responded to American movements with well-coordinated counterattacks now reacted more slowly and less effectively, suggesting their command and control was degrading. American casualties from ambushes and counterattacks declined measurably, a statistical trend that analysts attributed to various factors, but that may have been significantly influenced by the disruption of German courier communications. The snipers employing Hayes' technique understood the connection, recognizing that their interdiction of couriers was having strategic effects disproportionate to the small number of enemy soldiers they were killing. This recognition reinforced their commitment to the technique despite its unconventional nature and the risks involved in deviating from established doctrine. The situation came to official attention on November 27th when Captain Richard Dalton, the battalion intelligence officer, was reviewing after-action reports and noticed an unusual pattern. Multiple sniper teams were reporting successful engagement of courier pairs, with both couriers killed in rapid succession before messages could be delivered. Dalton understood enough about sniper operations to know this should not be possible using standard techniques, that the time required to cycle bolt-action rifles between shots should allow second couriers to escape. He began investigating, interviewing snipers, and eventually identifying Hayes as the originator of the technique that was spreading through the regiment. Dalton's initial reaction was bureaucratic alarm. Soldiers were modifying established procedures without authorization, potentially exposing themselves to unnecessary risk and creating liability issues if the modifications caused casualties. He reported his findings to Major William Foster, the battalion commander, recommending that the unauthorized technique be prohibited and that Hayes be disciplined for initiating deviation from doctrine without proper approval through chain of command. Foster's response reflected the tension between institutional conservatism and battlefield pragmatism that characterized military organizations attempting to adapt to combat realities. On one hand, Foster recognized that doctrine existed for good reasons, that procedures had been developed through experience and analysis to maximize effectiveness while minimizing risk, and that allowing individual soldiers to modify these procedures without authorization created dangerous precedent. On the other hand, Foster was a combat veteran who understood that doctrine represented guidelines rather than absolute rules, that battlefield conditions often required adaptation, and that innovations emerging from soldiers actually doing the fighting often proved more valuable than procedures developed by rear echelon staff who lacked current combat experience. He directed Dalton to conduct thorough investigation of Hayes' technique, assessing both its tactical effectiveness and its risk profile, before making any decisions about whether prohibit or authorize its continued use. Dalton assigned this task to Lieutenant James Morrison, a former sniper instructor who now served on battalion staff and possessed the technical expertise to evaluate Hayes' innovation properly. Morrison spent 2 days with Hayes and the other snipers employing the technique, observing their positions, watching demonstrations of the modified bolt cycling procedure, and analyzing after-action reports documenting their engagements. His assessment, delivered to Foster on November 30th, was nuanced and carefully reasoned. Morrison confirmed that Hayes' technique violated standard sniper doctrine in several specific ways, particularly regarding firing multiple shots from one position and using elevated rests that created silhouette vulnerabilities. However, Morrison also documented that the technique achieved measurably better results in the specific mission of courier interdiction, that snipers employing were successfully engaging targets that standard techniques could not interdict, and that no casualties had resulted from the increased risk exposure the technique created. Morrison recommended that rather than prohibiting the technique outright, Foster should authorize it as a specialized procedure for specific high-value targets, with appropriate training and guidelines to ensure soldiers understood both its applications and its limitations. This recommendation balanced institutional concerns about unauthorized modifications with pragmatic recognition that effective innovations should be encouraged rather than suppressed. Foster accepted Morrison's recommendation with modifications. He authorized continued use of Hayes' technique for courier interdiction and similar high-value multi-target scenarios, but required that any sniper employing it first receive formal instruction from Hayes or another qualified practitioner and demonstrate proficiency before using it in combat. Foster also directed that the technique be documented properly, with written procedures and training materials prepared, so that knowledge would not be lost to Hayes or other key practitioners became casualties. Finally, Foster ordered Hayes to report to battalion headquarters to brief senior staff on his innovation, both to ensure commanders understood what their snipers were doing and to facilitate broader dissemination if the technique proved valuable beyond the immediate battalion. These directives represented institutional compromise, neither embracing Hayes' innovation unreservedly nor rejecting it despite its deviation from doctrine, but rather acknowledging its value while imposing structure to manage associated risks and ensure proper implementation. Hayes received notification of these directives on December 2nd, reporting to battalion headquarters the following day for what he expected would be a routine briefing. Instead, Hayes found himself facing an unexpected proceeding that had serious implications for his military career. Major Foster opened the meeting by acknowledging the tactical effectiveness of Hayes's courier interdiction technique, but then pivoted to addressing what he characterized as a serious breach of military discipline. Hayes had developed and disseminated a modification to established procedures without seeking approval through proper channels, had taught other soldiers to employ unauthorized techniques, and had essentially created parallel doctrine that competed with official procedures. Foster emphasized that regardless of whether Hayes's technique was effective, the process by which it had been developed and spread was unacceptable in a military organization that depended on clear chain of command and standardized procedures. He informed Hayes that he was initiating non-judicial punishment under Article 15 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, charging Hayes with failure to follow established procedures and with conduct that could have endangered other soldiers by encouraging them to employ risky techniques without proper authorization or oversight. The punishment would include formal reprimand, reduction in rank from corporal to private first class, and forfeiture pay, penalties that would significantly impact Hayes's military record and future prospects. Hayes was stunned by this turn of events, having expected recognition rather than punishment for developing an innovation that was measurably improving tactical outcomes. He attempted to defend his actions, arguing that he had been trying to solve a legitimate tactical problem that was costing American lives, that his technique had proven effective in combat, and that he had not deliberately flouted authority, but rather had developed a solution to an immediate problem without initially recognizing it would be viewed as violation of doctrine. Foster acknowledged these points, but maintained that Hayes's good intentions did not excuse his failure to work through proper channels. If Hayes had believed courier interdiction required new techniques, he should have reported this assessment to his chain of command and requested authorization to develop and test modifications to standard procedures. Instead, he had acted unilaterally, implementing changes that affected not only his own operations, but those of other snipers who adopted his approach. Foster stated that accepting Hayes' unilateral action without consequence would send message that soldiers could modify procedures whenever they personally disagree with doctrine, a precedent that would undermine military discipline and potentially endanger lives when less skilled soldiers attempted modifications without adequate knowledge or judgment. The proceeding concluded with Hayes accepting the Article 15 punishment rather than demanding court-martial, recognizing that the charges against him were technically valid even if he disagreed with their underlying premises. But Foster added an unexpected element to the punishment, what he termed constructive consequences, that would channel Hayes' obvious tactical aptitude in more productive directions. Rather than returning Hayes immediately to his sniper duties, Foster assigned him to work with Lieutenant Morrison on developing formal training materials documenting the courier interdiction technique, creating standardized procedures that could be taught systematically rather than spreading through informal networks. Additionally, Hayes would serve as instructor for a 3-day training program that would teach qualified snipers throughout the division how to employ the technique properly, ensuring consistent implementation and reducing risks associated with soldiers learning through trial and error. These assignments represented both punishment and recognition, removing Hayes from his preferred role, while acknowledging that his expertise had value that should be preserved and disseminated. Hayes spent December developing training materials under Morrison's supervision, documenting every aspect of the rafter rest positioning and modified boat cycling technique. The process required translating intuitive knowledge gained through practice into explicit instructions that other snipers could follow. Hayes discovered that many elements of his technique that felt obvious to him were actually quite subtle, involving body mechanics and timing that required careful explanation to convey properly. Morrison's instructional design expertise proved invaluable, helping Hayes structure the training in ways that built skills progressively and included specific checkpoints to verify student proficiency before advancing to more complex elements. The resulting training package included written procedures, diagrams showing proper positioning, and practice drills that developed the muscle memory necessary for rapid boat cycling. Field testing with volunteer snipers confirmed that the training materials were effective, that soldiers who completed the program could successfully employ Hayes' technique in combat scenarios. The formal training program commenced in mid-December, with Hayes instructing 3 cohorts of 8 snipers, each over a 9-day period. The training proved challenging for students, many of whom had years of experience with standard techniques and found the modified procedures counterintuitive initially. Hayes emphasized that his technique was not superior to standard procedures in all situations, that it represented specialized application for specific high-value scenarios, and that students should maintain proficiency in conventional sniper employment while adding the courier interdiction technique to their capabilities. This balanced approach helped overcome resistance from traditionalists who worried that Hayes's innovation would replace rather than supplement established doctrine. By late December, 24 qualified snipers throughout the division were employing the technique, with documented success rates in courier interdiction improving from approximately 15% using standard methods to over 60% using Hayes's approach. The statistical improvement confirmed what anecdotal reports had suggested, that the technique was genuinely more effective for its intended purpose despite the risks and complexity it entailed. Official recognition of Hayes's contribution came through unexpected channels. In January 1945, a visiting general from division headquarters observed one of Hayes's training sessions and questioned why such an effective technique had not been disseminated more broadly throughout the Army. When briefed on the technique's origins and Hayes's punishment for developing it without authorization, the general expressed skepticism about the appropriateness of punishing innovation that saved lives. He directed that Hayes's Article 15 punishment be reviewed at division level, with particular focus on whether the punishment served legitimate disciplinary purposes, or whether it reflected bureaucratic defensiveness about procedures being modified by junior enlisted personnel. This review ultimately resulted in partial reversal of Hayes's punishment. His reduction in rank was upheld, maintaining the principle that proper channels must be followed, but his forfeiture pay was rescinded, and his formal reprimand was modified to acknowledge both his violation of procedures and his positive contribution to tactical effectiveness. More significantly, the general directed that Hayes's technique be incorporated into division-level sniper training, and that materials be forwarded to Army training centers for potential inclusion in institutional sniper courses. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 before Hayes's technique achieved widespread adoption throughout the Army, but its influence extended beyond immediate wartime applications. Post-war analysis of sniper operations during the Hürtgen Forest fighting noted the effectiveness of courier interdiction in degrading German tactical coordination, with Hayes's innovation specifically cited as contributing to improved American operational effectiveness during the final months of the campaign. This analysis fed into broader studies of small unit tactics that informed post-war doctrine development, contributing to more flexible approaches that encouraged innovation from junior personnel while maintaining appropriate oversight and risk management. Hayes's experience became a case study in military education programs that addressed the tension between standardization and adaptation, used to illustrate both the value of frontline innovation and the importance of working through proper channels to ensure innovations were evaluated and implemented responsibly. Hayes himself completed his military service in December 1945, declining offers to remain in the Army despite the skills and experience he had accumulated. He returned to Wyoming, resuming civilian life and rarely discussing his wartime service. The reduction in rank that accompanied his Article 15 punishment remained in his service record, affecting certain veterans' benefits and creating a permanent record that suggested disciplinary problems despite the circumstances surrounding the punishment. Hayes accepted these consequences with equanimity, believing that his innovation had saved lives and that this accomplishment mattered more than rank or recognition. He maintained correspondence with several snipers he had trained, sharing updates on their post-war lives and occasionally discussing tactical lessons from their shared experiences. These relationships provided connection to a period of his life that had been intense and meaningful in ways a civilian existence could never replicate. Times when decisions carried life or death stakes, and when skill and innovation directly influenced whether people lived or died. The rafter rest positioning technique that had enabled Hayes's rapid bolt cycling eventually found its way into formal sniper training programs, though often without attribution to Hayes or acknowledgement of its origins in unauthorized battlefield innovation. Training manuals published in the 1950s included variations of Hayes's positioning concepts, describing them as techniques for rapid engagement of multiple targets without mentioning that they had been developed by a corporal who was court-martialed for violating doctrine. This erasure of individual contribution in favor of institutional knowledge reflected common patterns in military organizations where innovations became absorbed into doctrine without maintaining clear lineage to their originators. Hayes learned about these training materials from veteran snipers who contacted him after recognizing elements of his technique in official publications. And while he found a lack of attribution mildly frustrating, he took satisfaction in knowing that his methods were being taught to new generations of soldiers who might face similar challenges he had confronted. Modern sniper training incorporates principles that trace directly to Hayes' innovation, though the specific mechanical techniques have evolved with changes in weapon systems. The fundamental insight that Hayes demonstrated, that courier interdiction and similar multi-target scenarios justified modified procedures emphasizing speed over deliberation, became accepted wisdom in sniper doctrine. Contemporary training emphasizes flexibility and judgment, teaching snipers to assess tactical situations and select appropriate techniques rather than rigidly following single standardized procedure regardless of circumstances. This doctrinal evolution reflects lessons learned through experiences like Hayes's, where rigid adherence to standard procedures produced suboptimal outcomes, and where thoughtful adaptation improved effectiveness. Military historians studying tactical innovation during World War II cite Hayes's courier interdiction technique as exemplifying successful bottom-up innovation that eventually influenced institutional doctrine despite initial resistance from commanders concerned about unauthorized modifications to established procedures. Jack Hayes passed away in 2001 at age 81. His obituary noting his military service and sniper qualification, but providing no details about the techniques he developed or the controversy surrounding their implementation. His personal effects included notebooks documenting his observations about sniper employment and courier interdiction, materials that were donated to a military history archive where they remain available for researchers studying small unit tactics during World War II. Several historians who have examined these materials note their sophistication, Hayes' systematic approach to analyzing tactical problems and developing solutions, and the careful documentation he maintained despite working under combat conditions that made such record-keeping difficult. These notebooks reveal Hayes as thoughtful tactical innovator rather than reckless maverick, someone who understood doctrine and violated it only after careful analysis suggested that specific circumstances justified deviation. This characterization complicates simplistic narratives about rule-breaking heroes, showing instead that effective military innovation requires both respecting institutional knowledge and recognizing when circumstances demand adaptation. The broader lessons from Hayes' story extend beyond specific techniques for rapid bolt cycling or courier interdiction. At their core, these lessons concern how military organizations balance standardization with adaptation, how they encourage innovation while managing risk, and how they respond when junior personnel identify problems and develop solutions that challenge established doctrine. Hayes' experience demonstrates both the potential and the pitfalls of bottom-up innovation in hierarchical organizations. His technique was genuinely effective, measurably improving tactical outcomes in ways that saved lives and degraded enemy capabilities. But his unilateral implementation without proper authorization created legitimate concerns about discipline and precedent, concerns that commanders had to address regardless of the technique's effectiveness. The eventual resolution, partial punishment combined with formal adoption and dissemination of the innovation, represents pragmatic compromise that neither fully vindicates nor completely condemns Hayes' approach, but rather acknowledges the complexity of the situation and attempts to extract maximum value while maintaining necessary discipline. Contemporary military organizations continue grappling with similar tensions as they attempt to foster innovation while maintaining the standardization and discipline that large-scale operations require. Formal programs have been established to capture and evaluate soldier-developed innovations, creating channels through which personnel can propose modifications to equipment or procedures without facing the kind of bureaucratic resistance Hayes encountered. These programs represent institutional learning from historical experiences, recognition that valuable tactical knowledge often resides with frontline personnel, and that organizations must create mechanisms to access this knowledge systematically. But tensions remain between those who emphasize following established procedures and those who advocate for flexibility and adaptation. Hayes' story offers no simple resolution to these tensions. instead illustrating that both perspectives contain valid insights and that effective organizations must somehow accommodate both standardization and innovation simultaneously. The human dimension of Hayes' experience deserves emphasis beyond tactical and institutional analysis. He was a young man serving in brutal combat conditions, watching friends die in ways that might have been prevented if communications interdiction had been more effective. His innovation emerged from this intensely personal context, from frustration with doctrine that seemed to prioritize process over outcomes, from moral conviction that saving lives justified taking risks that doctrine discouraged. The courage required to develop and implement his technique under these circumstances transcended physical bravery in combat, encompassing intellectual courage to challenge established wisdom and moral courage to accept responsibility for choices that might endanger himself and others. Hayes' willingness to accept punishment for his unauthorized actions, combined with his subsequent willingness to teach and document his technique so others could benefit, demonstrated character that elevated his innovation above mere tactical cleverness into something more significant, an example of how individuals can contribute to collective success by combining technical skill with ethical commitment to purposes larger than personal advancement. As decades pass and World War II transitions from living memory to history, stories like Hayes' risk being simplified into anecdotes about clever techniques divorced from a human context that gave them meaning. Preserving deeper understanding requires maintaining connections between tactical details about rafter rests and bolt cycling with broader narratives about courage, sacrifice, and the moral complexities of military service. Hayes' rafters only sniper rest and his rapid engagement technique represented more than mechanical innovations. They embodied a young man's determination to prevent unnecessary deaths, his willingness to challenge authority when conscience demanded it, and his acceptance of consequences for choices he believed were necessary. The technique saved lives, changed doctrine, and contributed to eventual Allied victory, but perhaps more importantly, it demonstrated that ordinary individuals facing extraordinary circumstances can make meaningful differences through courage, creativity, and commitment to purposes beyond themselves. Jack Hayes returned to Wyoming and lived a quiet life, but the forest trails where his innovation prevented German courier communications from coordinating attacks remained testament to what he had accomplished, silent witness to the power of individual initiative when aligned with just purposes and sustained by moral courage.